I'll never forget how much Robert and Linda Miller gave to the 3 kids they brought into their home: food, love, and the hope of a better future. But time and hard living wore them down, and when they needed their children most, those kids turned away, leaving the old couple stranded on a falling-apart farm just outside Nashville. For years, Robert and Linda carried their pain quietly. Then one afternoon, while poking through the dust-filled attic, Robert stumbled upon a chest that changed the course of everything. Not long after, the children came back, expecting to claim some treasure. What they walked into, though, was nothing like the riches they had imagined. The summer heat clung heavy over the Millers' place, the kind of heat that sticks to your skin and makes every breath feel like a chore. Robert, his shoulders bent from a lifetime of work, sat out on the porch, resting his rough hands on his knees. Beside him, Linda pulled an old knitted shawl close, even though the sun was blazing overhead. Time had slowed them both, but their eyes, deep, proud, and kind, still showed the history of sacrifices no one seemed to remember. They'd never had much money, not even comfort, but when the chance came to adopt 3 children, James, Emily, and Brian, they didn't think twice. Color never mattered to Robert and Linda. What they had were open arms, big hearts, and a little farm that barely kept them going year to year. Those kids became their everything. The Millers carried those children on tired backs, fed them even when the cupboards were almost bare, and scraped up enough pennies to buy shoes, books, and a shot at something better. But when the kids grew up, what Robert and Linda thought would be their reward, company in their old age, warmth of family, turned into cold silence and distance. I remember one evening clear as day. Linda stood in the kitchen, watching Emily shove fancy clothes into a suitcase. James leaned against the wall, looking annoyed. "This place is nothing but dirt and dust," he muttered. "We can't live like this anymore." Brian, the youngest, chuckled as he brushed past his mother without so much as a glance. "You really think we're staying here? Please, we've got lives to live." Linda's lips shook as she reached out, touching Emily's sleeve, her voice cracking. "We gave you everything we had. Every ounce of sweat was for you. How can you walk away from us now?" But Emily wouldn't meet her eyes. She zipped her suitcase shut and pulled her arm away. That night, folks around town said they saw the 3 of them heading down the dirt road, not once looking back. Neighbors whispered. Some shook their heads, calling it shameful. Others muttered that maybe the Millers had been too soft, and the kids just wanted more than a poor farm life could offer. Robert stood in the doorway, watching the dust of their footsteps fade. His hand gripped the wooden frame, knuckles white, but he said nothing. Beside him, Linda lowered herself into a chair, her breathing shallow, as though every step those kids took away pulled a piece of life from her chest. That night, the old farmhouse groaned in the wind, emptier than it had ever been. And for the first time in decades, Robert and Linda were truly alone. The seasons changed, but the farm felt stuck in sorrow. Weeds swallowed the garden rows, barns sagged into the earth, and the fields that once fed them grew silent. Every morning, Robert still rose before dawn, not because there was much to do, but because habit was the only thing keeping him going. He'd shuffle out to the porch, sit in that same wooden chair, and stare across the dry fields like he was begging them for forgiveness. Linda grew frilier. Her hands, once steady with sewing or kneading bread, trembled just holding a cup of water. Sometimes the neighbors saw her wrapped in that old shawl, moving slowly from the house to the porch, eyes lowered. Folks pitied her, though pity always carried whispers. "Such a shame," one woman whispered to another along the roadside. "They treated those kids like their very own, and look at how they've repaid them." The other shook her head. "Blood or not, you'd think adoption would mean something. But those kids. I don't think they ever truly saw Robert and Linda as their parents." The Millers never heard those words spoken aloud, but they felt them, heavy in every sidelong glance, in the silence when neighbors turned their eyes away. Their kids never called, never wrote. Word of their lives only reached the Millers through gossip passed around like scraps. James was in the city, sharp in his suits. Emily posted pictures of her travels, smiling in places her parents could barely imagine. Brian had an office job somewhere, though he never bothered to share the details. Neighbors mentioned seeing James's face on a flyer for some law firm, or Emily's name in the paper tied to a fancy charity gala. Robert and Linda would just listen, nodding calmly, though inside their hearts pressed hard against their ribs. Robert still tried to keep the farm alive. He patched leaking roofs with mismatched boards, dug out old rusted tools to fix broken gates, even when his cracked hands bled from the cold. But the land seemed to laugh at him, the fields offering only dust. One bitter winter morning, Linda collapsed, and it shook Robert to his core. He rushed to her side, knees buckling as he lifted her gently, calling her name again and again. She stirred just enough to whisper, "I'm only tired." He sat with her for hours, holding her hand until her breathing steadied. That night, as the wind howled through the cracks in the old farmhouse, Robert lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't help but wonder if this was how their story would end, two old souls, abandoned and forgotten, fading where no one cared. But fate, quiet as it had been, wasn't finished with them. One evening, while fixing a roof beam, Robert's hand brushed against a loose board. Behind it, hidden in the dust and shadows of the attic, his fingers found the edge of a wooden chest. It looked like it had been waiting there for decades. Robert stared at it, stunned, as though it had no business being tucked away in that place. His hands shook as he dragged it free, the wood creaking like it carried a memory. The chest was heavier than he expected, covered in cobwebs, its brass latch turned green with age. He sat for hours in the dim attic, running his rough fingers across the surface, hesitating to open it. It felt like he was holding history, secrets left behind by the generations who had lived and died on that land. Finally, with a trembling hand, he unlatched it. The sound cracked through the silence like thunder. Inside were stacks of yellowed letters, brittle papers, and thick envelopes. At first, he thought it was just old correspondence, long forgotten. But then he unfolded one paper, and his breath caught. It was a deed, his family's deed, showing that their land wasn't just farmland. It was tied to mineral rights buried beneath the soil. His grandfather had signed those papers nearly half a century before, leaving the rights to Robert's bloodline. Buried in that chest was proof: the miller's farm, poor as it looked, sat on land of enormous worth. Robert clutched the papers to his chest, tears filling his eyes. All those years of scraping by, nights going hungry, neighbors mocking them as nothing more than poor farmers, the truth had been sitting above their heads all along. When he carried the box downstairs, Linda was waiting by the fire, her thin hands folded in her lap. She looked up, weary but curious, as Robert spread the papers across the table. He explained in a hushed, halting voice, still barely believing it himself. Linda leaned in, eyes widening. "Robert, are you saying, after all this time?" He nodded slowly, his throat tightening. "This land isn't worthless, Linda. It never was. It's been holding something all along, something bigger than us." They didn't rush into anything. Robert spent weeks taking the papers into town, meeting with a lawyer who raised his brows higher with each page. Soon enough, whispers started again. But this time they weren't whispers of pity, they were whispers of curiosity. Neighbors saw men in suits stepping out of cars, walking the edges of the miller's property, pointing, measuring. Some muttered, "What are the Millers up to now?" Others scoffed, certain it would all come to nothing. The Millers didn't say much, and that silence only fueled the mystery. At night, Linda would sit at the kitchen table, her thin hand stroking the edges of the papers like they were sacred relics. A faint smile, the first in years, touched her lips as she whispered, "Maybe this is God's way of giving us back what we lost." Their clothes still hung loose on their frail frames, the house was still worn, but a new light had sparked in their eyes. Something was shifting. And the children who had once turned their backs had no idea what was coming. Word spread quickly in a small town. First, it was murmurs in the general store, did you see those men in suits up at the miller's place?" By the next week, everyone knew the old farm wasn't as worthless as it had seemed. Some folks guessed oil, others said developers. But no one knew for sure, except Robert and Linda. Then, like moths drawn to a flame, the children showed up again. James rolled up first in a sleek car, his polished shoes clicking against the same dirt driveway that once shredded the soles of his father's boots. Emily stepped out next, her dress too fine for farm dust, her smile brittle. Brian arrived last, slapping his parents on the back with a show of warmth that rang hollow. Soon the old kitchen was filled with their chatter, laughter, and exaggerated affection. From across the fields, neighbors shook their heads. "Look who's back," one muttered. "Didn't see them when the roof was caving in." Another sighed, "Now that there's talk of money, suddenly they remember who raised them." Inside, Robert sat quiet, his weathered hands folded. Linda was beside him, fragile but steady. They listened as the children spoke of family, of staying connected, of making up for lost time. But underneath their words lay something sharper, expectation. They were waiting for an inheritance they thought was theirs by right. When the lawyer arrived, briefcase heavy with contracts, the children leaned forward eagerly. Their names hovered on their tongues, ready to be written into wealth they believed they deserved. But Robert's voice cut through the room, low and steady. "This land," he said, "was never about money. It was about sacrifice. And sacrifice is something the three of you never learned." James's smile stiffened. Emily's eyes flickered with unease. Brian muttered under his breath. The lawyer cleared his throat and began reading. The mineral rights and the land, worth millions, were being placed into a charitable trust. That fortune would go to struggling farmers, to adoption centers, and to scholarships for children who understood gratitude. Not 1 cent would go to the kids who had walked away. The room went still. Emily's jaw dropped. James slammed his palm against the table. Brian stormed out, cursing under his breath. Outside, neighbors whispered with approval. One man said softly, "That's justice. Plain and simple." Linda reached for Robert's hand, her grip weak but sure. For the first time in years, they felt lighter. Their legacy wasn't just preserved, it would live on in the hands of those who knew the value of love and sacrifice. That evening, as the sun sank behind the horizon, Robert and Linda sat together on the porch, their fingers entwined, watching the wind ripple across the fields. Their bodies were still tired, the house still creaked with age, but their story had finally found its meaning. The children left empty-handed. The legacy remained eternal. Robert and Linda's story stands as a reminder: gratitude costs nothing, but it can change everything. Betrayal cuts deep, but justice always finds its way home.